Good evening and welcome to today's episode of Have We Got Planning News for You? My name's Charlie Banner from Keating Chambers, joining you today from a beautiful house of my friend and client Owen Inskip in Gloucestershire, in advance of the Wiltshire EIP that starts tomorrow. We're delighted today to welcome, as our guest of the week, Lord Philip Hunt, who has been a energy minister in two governments, under Gordon Brown and under Keir Starmer, as well as having a whole host of other positions in government, in Parliament. He and I have been working together on the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, and before that as a leader in the NHS. So, Philip, we're really delighted that you're joining us. Can you tell us where you're calling us from, and what have you chosen as the theme for this evening?
Thank you very much. So it's great to be with you. Great to have this discussion. I'm actually speaking to you from Bloomsbury in central London. Looking forward to discussing some of the major challenges we face in this country, not least to do with planning, infrastructure development. So really looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, we're delighted to have you here. I should remind viewers that we don't charge a registration fee, but in lieu of that, we do encourage you to consider making a donation to charity. We have a list of the charities that we particularly support on our website, havewegotplanningnews4you.com, or of course, feel free to donate to a local charity of your choice. Let's introduce the panel next. Thea, lovely to see you. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Charlie. I'm in the brilliantly named Ashby de la Zouche this evening in a relatively nice hotel. My junior demanded leisure facilities, so the client conceded, and here we are. And I start an inquiry into some houses tomorrow.
Excellent. I did a case in Ashby de la Zouche many years ago, but didn't start an hotel. The whole my junior asked for it. I like that trick. I'll have that next time.
I could use it more often. Evening also, Lord Hunt, really fabulous to have you here.
Paul, lovely to see you, and that's particularly striking wallpaper behind you.
Yes, hello, Charlie. I'm in my wife's office, so it's rather more genteelly decorated than my office. So it's a joy to see everyone. It's a joy to see you, Lord Hunt. And because I didn't know what the theme was, Charlie, because you didn't tell everybody, I got something to drink from downstairs, which is called Death by Cherries. And if you like it, I don't know what that's got to do with anything to do with what we're going to talk about. But since I have a tradition of drinking horrible beer, cheers, everyone.
You really do, don't you? It doesn't look nice.
It's not good. It's not good.
Cora, lovely to see you.
Hi, Charlie. Lovely to see you too. I am joining from home in North London. And sadly, unlike 2 weeks ago, I don't have my whiskey with me. I've just got plain old glass of water, but delighted to be here.
What a pity. And Chris?
Hi, Charlie. I'm at home in Hogwarts Castle, as you know, because, of course, we're talking about the environment. And obviously, you haven't seen this fella for a while, have you? That's my owl presumption. Lord Hunt will now think I'm mad. And I am drinking out of my Aston Martin James Bond mug, but I've been feeling a little unwell, so I've been drinking honey in hot water. And to be honest, I'm just glad I've had back-to-back inquiries and I'm at home for once. So I did the school run and picked Henry up from school.
Lovely to hear. And Sasha, you're going to be leading an interview with later on. So how are you doing?
I'm very well. I've had a lovely afternoon on the Scottish Links. I'm at Turnberry, so nothing better than a round of golf on one of the great courses of the world to put you in a fabulous mood.
Fantastic. Well, you look like you had a good day, which is very pleasing to see.
I love the idea of a golfer finishing and being in a good mood. Most golfers I speak to are usually in a terrible mood after you must have had a good day, Sasha.
I had a very good day, very rare, so I'm enjoying it after yesterday when I nearly gave the game up.
So we're going to start this evening with the news update from Paul. So over to you, Paul, to tell us about the latest planning news.
Hello, Charlie. Smooth as ever. So I'm delighted to say there isn't much news in the planning world this week, unless that is you want me to talk about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill yet again, which I point blank refuse to do, largely because you're in it all the time. So I've got three things to raise, unlike Sasha's 17 points that he raised last time when talking about the news. The first of which is PINs are to go fully digital, it was announced today. And from next month, PINs will scrap the issuing of paper forms for appeals and move to a fully digital service, it turns out. Well, great news. Welcome to the 21st century to the Planning Inspectorate. It's probably worth just musing on the fact that 5 years ago, Robert Jenrick made a promise about transforming planning in terms of IT and paying out £100 million to digitise planning. Well, there's been a series of pilot projects, and some of them are still going on, but there's precious little evidence that planning is being digitised more widely. Who knows where that might lead? But there's an expose in today's planning magazine, Update, which suggests that perhaps nowhere at all. That said, one has to rather wonder why we still have a requirement for publicity of planning applications as if they were submitted in the 1950s and that we've got to write to locals and put up signs, etc. Why can't we just have a database like, I don't know, emails that people can register, and you can register for interest in your area and you can be notified? Okay. It's all science fiction, no doubt. Anyway, second item in the news, best quote of the week. I am not trying to gain a case by the back door, but I have to say this tickled me when I saw it. So it's a case called Edith Weston Parish Council against the Secretary of State and Phil Davis, whoever Phil Davis is. And it's His Honour Judge Jarman in typically Denning-esque mood, because he was dealing with the issue about an application to quash an allowed appeal for 62 dwellings. And it was all about an error that the inspector had supposedly made, where a neighbourhood plan had been made after the close of the hearing.
Paul, I'm covering this case, mate.
Okay, it's the quote I was going to pick out.
Okay, that's fine. Just take the quote, but leave me something.
Okay. But anyway, what I love about the quotation is that I've now had the wind taken out of my sails completely. What I love about the quotation is the observation that His Honour Judge Jarman made about the fact that nobody had told the inspector about something, where he said, for reasons which remain unclear, no one bothered to tell the inspector. Not a great thing. It's the kick in the teeth in paragraph 1 of an appeal decision. Anyway, Chris will tell you what happened in that case now, and we'll manage to...
To be fair, you usually take the wind out of my sails.
Well, we'll continue puffing away to each other. Right, Star of the Week. This is something we've not done for an awfully long period of time, and I'm not genuinely just padding out the news by nicking Chris's case and also throwing other things. But Star of the Week goes to, I am happy to say, Richard Kimbling KC, as he currently is. Soon to be appointed, the Honourable Mr. Justice Kimbling, and that way your letters patent merge, so he no longer is Richard Kimbling KC. And Richard is from Thea and Chris's Chambers. He's a superb lawyer, thoroughly decent individual, and despite his many important cases, the newspapers have announced over the weekend nothing more than he happened to be the barrister acting for Jeremy Clarkson in the Diddley Squat case. A whole prestigious career, and that's what you get in terms of your notification. However, it's not the only point, and number 5 are having a particularly good week because this week, the former number 5 practitioner, who was once known as Ian Dove QC, will be appointed to the Court of Appeal from the High Court and will soon become Lord Justice Dove. As I understand it, and please tell me if I'm wrong, I think Richard was Thea's pupillage supervisor and Sir Ian was Chris's pupillage supervisor. So frankly, congratulations to at least 2 of the members of the team, both for their chambers and for their pupillage supervisors. Great week for number 5 chambers.
Cheers, Paul. Indeed, congratulations indeed to Richard Kimbling, who I was against in court last week, probably his last case, I guess. So congratulations to him. Now, I'm going to deal with the first case. I'm going to talk about a judgment of the Court of Appeal, which Paul hasn't mentioned in his news slot, mercifully. Stop Portland Waste. So this is a judgment of the Court of Appeal through the lead judgment of Lord Justice Holgate, dismissing an appeal by the claimants against the judgment of Mrs. Justice Lang, who had dismissed their claim for statutory review of the Secretary of State's decision to allow an appeal by Power Fuel Portland Limited in relation to an energy recovery facility on the Isle of Portland, a Portland port. The key issue in the appeal related to the approach of the Secretary of State to giving reasons for his decision. The scheme was an unallocated development, and the claimants alleged that the Secretary of State hadn't given adequate reasons on whether the development had satisfied the proximity principle, which was set out in the waste plan of the Waste Planning Authority. Paragraph 14, the judgment outlines that the proximity principle was explained in the waste plan as meaning that waste should be recovered or disposed of as close as possible to where it's produced, and that this was a critical driver for the waste plan in order to ensure a high level of protection for the environment and public health. And that was a key point, so the claimant said, of their case against the development, and one which the Secretary of State failed to grapple with. The judgment on the facts held that the Secretary of State had appropriately given reasons in relation to the proximity principle. Much of the judgment turns on the particular facts of the case, but there is a section, paragraphs 26 and following the judgment, which sets out or summarises the key principles in relation to a challenge by judicial or statutory review to a planning appeal decision on the basis that inadequate reasons have been given. And what Lord Justice Holgate said is to be legally adequate, that the reasons for a decision need only provide conclusions on the principal important controversial issues. They don't need to give reasons on every material consideration or matter raised. He went on to say reasons must not give rise to a substantial doubt as to whether the decision-maker erred in law, and they should also enable unsuccessful opponents of development to understand how the policy or approach underlying the decision may impact on future such applications. And he also stressed that decision letters should be read in a straightforward manner, recognising that they address to parties well aware of the issues involved and the arguments advanced. And lastly and importantly, a reasons challenge will only succeed if the party aggrieved can satisfy the court that it's genuinely been substantially prejudiced by the failure to provide an adequately reasoned decision. So that was the judge's summary of the key principles relating to reasons challenges. No new law there, but a pithy and helpful summary useful in future cases. On the facts of the case, as I said, the court felt that adequate reasons had been given. In particular, the court considered that the proximity principle was dealt with by implication because the inspector, whose report the Secretary of State agreed with, had held that the proposed development would represent a clear improvement on the existing situation, which, due to unmet needs for this kind of facility, waste would continue to be moved from land to landfill and energy recovery facilities beyond Dorset. And so on that basis, the appeal scheme was consistent with the proximity principle because it would bring energy recovery closer to the source than it currently was. And secondly, it was held by the inspector, and again, the Secretary of State agreed, that alternatives that had been put forward by the claimants could be discounted because they were in the green belt, and therefore the substantial weight to be given to harm to the green belt would justify their exclusion from consideration. So although the proximity principle doesn't appear to be expressly referred to in the relevant parts of the decision, implicitly it was taken into account in those findings and indeed others, and therefore there was no failure to give reasons. And that demonstrates that the approach the courts in reasons challenges will tend to be to focus on the substance of the decision rather than has a particular factor been name-checked. It's not a box-ticking exercise, but a search for whether in substance the key points have been adequately addressed. And the next case is Chris. Well, Paul has foreshadowed your case already, so now you can be the headline act, Chris, and tell us a bit more about the Edith Weston Parish Council High Court case.
Yes, let me tell you about a case that you won't have heard of. It's the legal challenge to an inspector's decision in the Edith Weston neighbourhood plan area. The decision was made on the 25th of February 2025. The inspector allowed an appeal granting outline planning permission for up to 62 dwellings, and it was land east of Normanton Road. Edith Weston is in Rutland, if you didn't know, and he allowed the appeal largely on the basis that the council could not demonstrate a 5-year supply of housing land. There was about a 3.5-year supply. So the council applied the inspector applied the presumption in favour of sustainable development in paragraph 11D2 of the MPPF, which told him to grant planning permission unless the adverse impacts of doing so would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. The proposal delivered market housing, 40% affordable housing, and some self-build housing as well. And the challenge was made on the basis that the inspector made his decision on the basis of an error. And the error was that he thought the Edith Weston neighbourhood plan had been made, but in fact 5 days before the decision was made, as a result of the referendum that had been passed in the parish, it became part of the development plan and replaced the previous neighbourhood plan. Under the legislative provisions, when a neighbourhood plan passes the referendum, even if it's not been formally made, it is treated as part of the development plan. And the judge said, and you may have heard this before, for reasons which remain unclear, it appears that no one bothered to tell the inspector. So it was agreed as a fact that the error had taken place, albeit obviously absolutely no fault of the inspector himself. The claimant, the parish council, argued that this mistake meant that the decision should be quashed. The inspector had treated the Edith Weston neighbourhood plan as a material consideration, whereas he plainly should have treated it as part of the development plan. And that is, as we all know, an important difference. The defendant, though, the Secretary of State, argued that despite the mistake, the inspector would have necessarily still allowed the appeal. So the key question is, would it have made any difference if he had treated the neighbourhood plan as made? And as the judge rightly observed, that's a high hurdle to say the outcome would have been the same. What's the test that the court apply? Well, it's known to lawyers as the simplex principle. And in simplex and the Secretary of State back in 2017, the court held that if the inspector would inevitably have still allowed the appeal, had the inspector not made the undisputed error, then his decision should not be quashed. And in the later case of Weston Holmes, Mr. Justice Holgate, as he then was, and now also in the Court of Appeal, we've got a lot of planning judges in the Court of Appeal, the test was whether it would be possible for the court to say that without the error, the decision would inevitably have been the same. And when you look at the inspector's reasoning in this case, it's fairly clear to see the outcome would have been the same. That's because the inspector deals extensively with the fact that the proposal was in conflict with the neighbourhood plan. And there was an adopted neighbourhood plan, then this emerging neighbourhood plan, because he found that it was outside the settlement boundary and none of the policies in the plan supported it. The policies in the local plan and the neighbourhood plan had sought to limit developments to within the limits of the settlement edge, and the standard exceptions existed for exception sites, so rural affordable housing exception sites and agricultural and forestry homes. But the inspector went on to deal with other aspects as well. He said as far as the services and facilities were concerned, there was moderate harm because of its suboptimal access and the conflict with the policies on accessibility in the core strategy in the neighbourhood plan. And he also addressed the effect on character and appearance, concluding that the harm to the countryside from a large number of homes on the edge of a small rural village was a matter of concern to him. So he found that overall there was a moderate adverse impact to the landscape policy in the neighbourhood plan. And he also treated the emerging neighbourhood plan as being at a very advanced stage, and overall he afforded significant weight to the harms. So in truth, the judge had little difficulty in saying the decision would inevitably have been the same if the inspector had treated the emerging neighbourhood plan as made, as indeed it was. And on ground 2, he recognised, this is the one about whether it met the criteria in paragraph 14, of the MPPF. The second ground was that he'd made that as a mistake, and he thought that paragraph 14 didn't apply. Paragraph 14, as is well known, applies a very different presumption, arguably a sort of reverse presumption, that whatever they might be, the adverse impacts of allowing housing that conflicts with a neighbourhood plan is likely to significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. That depends on two criteria. Had the neighbourhood plan become part of the development plan in the last 5 years? And did the neighbourhood plan contain policies and allocations that meet the identified need? And on the facts, again, it was obvious that the neighbourhood plan had in fact been made in the last 5 years. But as for whether it contained policies and allocations to meet the identified need, there was a policy that set out design principles for a site called the St George's Barracks, which had been granted planning permission on the 28th of November 2024. But that was before the neighbourhood plan had been made, and the policy only focused on the design issues and the reserve matters issues, and added to which the overall planning strategy in the neighbourhood plan said this: the plan does not undertake housing allocations, leaving this for the adopted core strategy. So the judge had little difficulty in concluding that in fact the neighbourhood plan didn't make allocations for new housing, because in fact the neighbourhood plan itself expressly said it wasn't, and was leaving that to the core strategy. So the inspector's decision was upheld, and well done to Heather Sargent for achieving that outcome.
Thanks, Chris. Sounds like a fascinating case. Now, Thea's going to tell us about the, is it perhaps Cory? The Cory Decarbonisation project, which sounds rather interesting. Probably something Philip will be quite interested in too.
Yeah, I think so. And obviously, we're really enjoying carbon capture and storage projects here at Have We Got Planning News for You? Because those who tuned in last week will remember Chris talking about the High Knot JR, which was dismissed. And this week I'm talking about I'm going with Cory, Charlie, Decarbonisation project. Now, this was a project that was submitted for development consent in March 2024. And I just want to pause to think about the timeline of this for a minute, because work on the site began in 2022, although that's the first published date, probably began a little before that. Consultation was carried out in 2023. The examination began in November 2024 and closed in May of this year, and the report went to the Secretary of State in August. So we're at least 3 years in for a project which the government regards as critical national priority infrastructure. And who knows whether there will be a challenge that slows the future progress of this scheme. If past experience is anything to go by, I think we can anticipate there is at least a risk. And I make that observation because we are marching towards 2050, and this is a technology that the government regards as absolutely necessary to transition to net zero. Those are the words. It's a necessity, not an option. You'll see that on your screens now. So why is that? Well, it's because while decarbonising the energy system is relatively straightforward, and I say that with my tongue firmly planted in my cheek, given the level of opposition to almost every renewables project I've ever been involved with, decarbonising industry is really quite difficult. We also know that the UK has one of the largest potential carbon dioxide storage capacities in Europe, with an estimated 78 billion tonnes of CO2 storage capacity under the seabed. The next point is that carbon capture storage technology is critical national priority infrastructure, capable of being so. That's a term that was introduced in EN1 and basically means that other than in exceptional circumstances, nationally significant low-carbon infrastructure projects should get consent. There is some nuance to that, but that point didn't even get a mention in the Secretary of State's decision letter, which I think is surprising. And by that, I don't mean that the urgent need for the project wasn't mentioned. It was. But this policy in EN1, a remarkable policy intervention, in my view. And it just doesn't get the airtime it deserves in decision letters like this. I should make clear that the examining authority did explore the issue thoroughly, so it's there. You just have to read through about 400 pages to get to it. But actually getting into the meat of the decision, this was a scheme in the London Borough of Bexley for a post-combustion carbon capture facility comprising of 2 carbon capture plants which are expected to capture a minimum of 95% of CO2 emissions from the existing adjacent energy from waste generation stations. And that equates then to approximately 1.6 million tonnes of CO2 per year that would be captured. And you can see the figure on your screen now, which shows the relationship between the plant and the 2 blue buildings, which are the energy from waste plants. There would be that relationship between the two. So it was a beneficial relationship. The issues in this case were numerous and included the principle of development, consideration of alternatives, impacts on air quality, biodiversity, climate change, historic environment, water environment, metropolitan open land, and townscape. And I don't think there's enough time in the entire 1 hour of the show to go through all of those. The headlines are this. First, development consent was granted. Perhaps there's no surprises there. Second, the decision of the examining authority, Jeff Underwood, is excellent. It contains pictures, and I really like that. And I would encourage all inspectors to do it. There's a picture from within the examining authority's report to the Secretary of State, and they are littered throughout. And that brings the text to life and really helps the reader to understand what's going on within the decision. The inspector also included a brilliant table of his findings using a traffic light system. As you can see again on your screen, going from the dark green all the way through to the red for the biggest negative effect. And what that does is really helps in interpreting the terms that were used by the examining authority. And that's something I think is really useful for planners to use in their proofs as well. It's always really useful to understand the scale that's been used and what the words used actually mean in their context. The Secretary of State didn't follow the same scale and gave great substantial positive weight to the contribution towards energy objectives and meeting the urgent national need for CCS infrastructure. And against that was the harm by virtue of the loss of metropolitan open land, which was afforded great negative weight in the planning balance, but that was overcome by the benefits of the scheme and amounted to very special circumstances. There was also moderate weight to biodiversity, townscape harm and visual amenity, and little negative weight to a range of other factors. And if that doesn't make the case for a nationally recognised scale of adjectives for benefits and harms, I don't know what does, because Secretary of State used different ones to the examining authority, not always defined, and we see that in a lot of decision letters, and I think it would be really quite helpful to have that. But back to you, Charlie.
Here, Thea. I completely agree. It could be easily done with PPG. No need for consultation. You stick it there, and wouldn't that be helpful? Anyway, there's an idea. Tora, you're going to take us to Kent and Ashford and tell us about a housing-related appeal that Hallam Land were involved in.
Thanks, Charlie. Yes, I'm going to talk about an appeal on land of South of Ham Street Road, which was an appeal by Hallam Land against the refusal of outline planning permission by Ashford Borough Council. I was going to keep the result of the appeal decision secret, but as you can see at paragraph 1 on your screen, the appeal was dismissed. So the main issues here were whether the site is in a sustainable location for development, and also the effect of the proposal on the character and appearance of the site and surrounding area, having particular regard to a nearby schedule of monument. However, I'm actually going to start with the 5-year supply position. The parties agreed there was no 5-year housing land supply. The council argues 3.27 years. The appellant argued 2.6. And the inspector went through a number of disputed sites and concluded that the figure was close to the appellant's figure and described it as seriously low. So useful for anyone doing appeals in Ashford Borough Council. Useful if you're the developer. The inspector in that context, unsurprisingly, gave significant weight to market housing, significant weight to affordable, moderate weight to self and custom build, to B&G, a bit of extra weight for some green space in excess of policy requirements, and moderate weight to economic benefits. But the question was, did that package significantly and demonstrably outweighed by the harms? So, turning to the harms, I'm going to start with location sustainability. the inspector found the settlement of Ham Street itself was locationally sustainable. And there was a policy which states essentially development on the edge of Ham Street is acceptable, subject to certain criteria, two of which related to whether it was within easy walking distance of basic day-to-day services, or has access to sustainable transport to access those services, and another criterion requiring it to be in a location where public transport could be maximised, as well as cycling and walking. So the village play area, community hall, GP, all houses would be within 800 metres of those facilities. And then a number of the houses were equally within 800 metres of a grocer's, a post office, a restaurant, a coffee shop, takeaway, etc. A number of facilities. And then within 2 kilometres was a primary school and a train station. And so that all looks pretty good for the developer. But then the inspector, or at least in my experience, it is unlikely to be a showstopper. But the inspector then looked at the ease of walking routes and found that one of them was a stepped access, which required crossing the road twice in order to get into the village with a narrow footway. And the other one was through a council car park, which the inspector was concerned about vehicle-pedestrian conflict, but also was unlit and had little natural surveillance. And so, having reviewed those walking routes, the inspector concluded the site was not in a sustainable location for development, found conflict with the relevant local and national policies. With regards to character and appearance, the site is not covered by any local or national designation, and the inspector recorded that it was not a valued landscape. And it was common ground between the parties that by year 15, the landscape and visual effects would be moderate or less, other than from within the site itself. But the inspector, which again seems, you'd be quite hopeful again with that sort of common ground between you and the council if you're the developer. But the inspector noted that the site was on significantly higher ground than land within the surrounding houses. And so it was very widely visible and highly sensitive to change. And further, it was on a hill which currently obscures views of Ham Street from the surrounding countryside. And so the inspector came to the view that it would be seen as an isolated development within the countryside, i.e. not against a backdrop of development. And so overall found it would be highly visually intrusive and entirely uncharacteristic of the surrounding landscape. And she gave that harm significant weight, and that also included some harm to the scheduled monument, or to its setting. So coming to the final planning balance, when doing the heritage balance, the inspector found that the low level of substantial harm to the scheduled monument was outweighed by the public benefits. But overall, applying the tilted balance, she gave significant weight to the lack of sustainability of location, very significant weight to the harm to the character and appearance of the site, and great weight to the harm to the setting of the scheduled monument, and overall found that those would significantly and demonstrably outweigh the benefits. Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Tora. Now, over to Sasha to introduce Philip in a bit more detail and kick off our interview with him. So over to you, Sasha.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Yes, good evening, Lord Hunt. Well, it's absolute pleasure to have you on the show tonight. I mean, when I looked at your CV, I think polymath is the only word that accurately describes it. I mean, it's quite...
hanging around for far too long, perhaps?
Absolutely not. It's remarkable the extent and depth and breadth of experience that you've collected in your public life. So just to introduce you to our viewers, you obviously, I think I work out you were brought up and went to school in Oxford, one of the nicer parts of this island. You were effectively went and did your degree at the University of Leeds. You then got a succession of jobs in health and health-related industries, and then you became the first chief executive of the NHS Confederation. You were then created a life peer in 1997. You were made president of the Royal Society of Public Health. You worked as a Minister of Health under the Blair government. You also worked in the Ministry of Justice under the Brown government. You then became Deputy Leader of the House of Lords in 2008 and then Minister of State for Sustainable Development, Climate Change, Adaptation and Air Quality, which is obviously pertinent for tonight's discussion. And you've been in the Privy Council since 2009. You've also been chair of the Heart of England NHS Foundation Trust. So I think with that very extensive list, anyone who is listening and judging will see why I introduced you as a polymath. But welcome to the show. And obviously, what's of interest to our viewers is the experience and knowledge that you bring in relation to matters pertaining to planning and particularly climate change and the challenges that we face. So if I could start off by asking you about the state of the nation, and I just want to ask you, in view of the kind of the teeth gnashing and the general angst that exists in relation to the political sphere, with your very long experience in public life, without making any party political points, but just generally, what's your view about the ability of those entrusted to decide such matters and their ability to solve the very significant problems we're facing, particularly in relation to the environment?
Sasha, that very generous introduction. I should say that although we're probably going to talk a lot about planning, the one thing that I've had very limited experience in my political career is planning. So don't expect expertise from me, but I do obviously have some very strong views, which actually relate to your first question, really. So obviously, globally, democracies are going through a very, very tough, pessimistic time. This country is no exception, but I'm a kind of glass full sort of person. I think there are some grounds for optimism. First of all, the government, and I think this is a much more a consensus, knows that we have to grow the economy. This has become absolutely essential to the future. That means we need to invest in our infrastructure, which has been neglected for so many years. And the 10-year programme announced last year, the £700 billion public-private investment in major infrastructure projects, I think is very, very exciting and potentially can really kickstart the economy. The efforts on housing, I know there's a lot of controversy about whether we'll reach the 1.5 million housing target. What's not in any doubt, and particularly for young people, is we have to do a hell of a lot better in the future in terms of building new homes, social housing, owner occupation, making it easier for people to own their own homes as well. And I think that the point is that is a great deal of focus by government. And that's really why we have the planning and infrastructure bill in the first place. Another big issue for me, important issue, is in defence. The Robinson Review, there is a general broad consensus. It might be difficult. It may take time. We have to invest in our defence services. And finally, I grounds for positivity. We're not going as far as I would wish, but resetting our relationship with the EU is crucial, both in terms of our relationship with our partners in Europe, but also for the economy going forward in the future. But if you're going to ask me about the balance sheet, what are my concerns? Well, I've talked about growth and infrastructure investment. I do think we are, in this country, we do seem to have an anti-growth culture. It is very noticeable that whenever some new idea, new project is proposed, immediately there is a huge anti-force that comes to the fore. And you guys know about this as well, because you're part of the whole process in which these things are decided. I do think we have a big problem in this country in terms of economic literacy. People simply don't connect the economy and the growth and health of the economy with our ability to spend on desirable public services. And listening to much of the debate that we had in the planning and infrastructure bill from people concerned about the environment, which I share, it all struck me that they really didn't get why we have to grow infrastructure as quickly as possible over the next few years. I think a further issue for us all is the demography of our country in so many Western democracies. I mean, the figures are pretty bloody, aren't they? I mean, I'm part of the aging population, but the proportion of people over 65 is growing. Huge demands being made on public services, particularly in health and social care. We have a declining number of people of working age in work. And we also then have an intergenerational fairness dynamic where essentially we're asking people in work to pay ever more taxes to fund people who, one reason or another, are not in work. And frankly, this is unsustainable. But the politics of our country, and indeed my party, make it pretty difficult to face up to some of those challenges. The winter fuel allowance debacle is an example, but I think more substantively is the difficulty in getting welfare reform through Parliament. One could mention the triple lock in relation to pension payments. All of these are very, very difficult issues, but which I think will need to be tackled. Now, many countries, I'm not mentioning migration, immigration, illegal migration, but clearly that goes to the heart of quite a lot of the tension in our country. And what the sort of problems we face, many other countries face similar issues. And I suppose at heart is a concern that politicians are wary of coming up with ideas which they feel the public will push back against. And I think at the moment we have a very, very difficult dialogue between people in leadership positions and the public they're there to serve. And reality in terms of decision making becomes ever much harder when you then have populist figures who will offer the moon, but which we know can't be delivered. And in a sense, I don't think our country is very different from many other countries in terms of the political class has lost the confidence of the public. But actually, I think politicians are very, very wary of being straight with the public, because the reality is we face some very, very tough, hard choices in the future.
Thank you. Incredibly interesting. Let's move on to the climate change crisis. And let me ask you, if you were asked by government to do an audit of where we are, what kind of mark would you give the UK government and why?
Okay, I'm gonna be generous. I think I get it up to 8 out of 10, because we are taking and have taken climate change seriously. The last government, Conservatives now, I think, are in retreat on net zero, but one should mention their very successful chairmanship of COP in Glasgow. It was Mrs. May, wasn't it, who signed us up legally to achieving net zero by 2050. And I mean, in terms of where we're going, we've got lots of targets. In terms of electricity generation and power, I believe we will. We may not get to clean power by 2030 exactly, but we're going to be there and thereabouts. And we've also seen, some fantastic investment and consents, indeed, in terms of offshore, onshore wind, solar. Major decisions about nuclear power, which really welcome. Sizewell C getting a final investment decision to support Rolls-Royce in the development of small modular reactors. Obviously, we've heard a bit earlier about carbon capture, usage and storage. again, a very important development. So I think in terms of action in this country, we are making progress. Yes, there's a long way to go. And yes, there are some real challenges which we can talk about. But I do think there is a drive there. And the government is sticking to its guns, despite the political pushback we're seeing both in this country, but in many other countries against net zero. And of course, the point is climate change is happening and the evidence gets clearer and clearer every day. I think internationally, the Prime Minister went to Brazil a few days ago. My old boss, Ed Miliband, is there. He will be in the heart of the negotiations. The hope is that a negotiation on climate finance will be agreed, and we all know the problem of major countries not being represented, and so getting agreement is going to be very difficult. But I think as far as I'm concerned, the UK government is right in the heart of those discussions. It is seen as a leader in terms of climate change, which from our international reputation is really good. And also, I talked earlier about growing the economy. Recent report by the CBI showed that the big area of growth in our economy is in what you might call the green or net zero sector. So in terms of the UK and our economy, I think that the drive on climate change makes real sense, both in terms of the emotion, the necessity of dealing as far as we can with climate change, but also the hard economics.
Yeah, absolutely. But moving on to renewable energy, I mean, Thea's talked about this. I mean, the rather depressing trend that is emerging is people opposing greatly renewable energy projects. And now there seems to be a massive bandwagon through the country to oppose, particularly solar farms seem to be the epitome of objection. So I just wondered, what approach do you think government can take to continuing the rollout of renewable energy through the planning system?
I mean, although you're right, we are hearing a lot of opposition, I have to say, in the House of Lords, particularly amongst opposition peers. Solar developments are not very welcome, and we hear the argument. Yeah, I thought you'd say that, Charlie. Obviously, the issue of using good agriculture land for solar does come up, but the consents that are being given are very, very important. The government has signalled the direction we're going in. We are not short of investors who wish to make investment, and I think the government will plough on. It has to plough on, despite opposition. And obviously, there is the planning, the consent process. But I'm pretty confident that we will get to clean power, if not by 2030, certainly pretty soon after that. Don't also forget the role of nuclear power in all of this. I'm a great advocate of nuclear power. The Hinkley Point C, well, that's an interesting case study in planning and environmental legislation and practice, isn't it? But it is due to come on stream between 29 and 31. 3.2 gigawatts will fuel 6 million homes. We're building a replica of that in Sizewell in East Anglia. The Rolls-Royce SMR program is really exciting as well. So when you take renewables and nuclear together, I think the government will plow on with this. We think we will get to our clean power target. And by the way, in doing that, we enhance both energy security, but also stability of prices.
And can I ask you, from your perspective in the House of Lords and your kind of interaction with government ministers and others involved in government, what would you say about how seriously planning is taken? I mean, often from our perspective, we see the kind of revolving door that is the Minister of Planning and the Secretary of State for Housing and local communities. But I just wanted your view, because you can see the wider picture. Do you think this government take planning seriously?
Whereas it does. And I can tell you that in terms of the infrastructure development we need, the growth agenda, I think ministers certainly recognise that planning has a key role to play. I should say, I mean, I'm guilty of the revolving door syndrome, although my first ministerial job in government, I was in the Department of Health for 4 years. I then did a tour of Whitehall. And look, it happens. It's the way we do politics in this country. And the reality is that if ministers are up to it, they can pick new issues up very quickly indeed. And I don't think a revolving door of ministers is really responsible for some of the challenges we have in planning. I think the very fact we had the planning and infrastructure bill, which has just left the House of Lords, going to the House of Commons for what we gloriously know as ping pong when there is a disagreement between both houses. But I think it's a sign of taking planning seriously, trying to streamline the planning process, but also, of course, ensuring that environmental protections are maintained. And one of the interesting pointers that I've always learned about government is that you have one department, the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, which is concerned to get housing developed as quickly as possible and needs a planning system to enhance that. My own old department, Energy, wanting energy infrastructure to be speeded through. And then in the Environment Department, DEFRA, more concerned about ensuring that the current environmental protections are not inhibited by a new planning regime. And so the planning infrastructure bill is a classic of legislation written by different departments in which somehow or other you try and hope it's a cohesive effort at the end. And, you know, we can talk about the planning infrastructure bills and some of the issues and concerns I have, but I certainly think it's a visible sign of government intent in relation to reforming the planning system. Whether it pulls it off, of course, is altogether another matter, which you as a team have as good a view as I do.
And what would you change in the planning system if you could, from your perspective?
Well, I mean, we've had a debate. I mean, Charlie's report on judicial review was a very good one. The government's taken that on board, but it could go further, as Charlie himself would say. I think actually one of the most interesting aspects of our debates has been not so much the planning system itself, but the interpretation by the bodies like Natural England of things like habitat regulation and a risk-averse approach. And you all know about the issue of acoustic fish at Hinkley Point C, or even the bats at HS2. I just raise them because, in a sense, they're kind of visible identification of some of the issues that we may still face. If I had a magic wand, I think that I might look at the Canadian experience. I don't know if you know about it, but in the light of President Trump's, shall we say, designs on the sovereignty of Canada, the Canadians, and this was a joint effort between the federal government and the provinces, came together to pass the One Canada Economy Act. And basically, they have many of the same problems we have in terms of the delays to infrastructure consents. And basically, they're all being taken out and dealt with at a national level, where ministers will make the final decision. That doesn't mean to say they are ignoring environmental concerns, but it does mean that at the very sort of senior political level, decisions are being made which says, look, we have to go ahead with certain of these infrastructure developments. We can't allow local processes, if you like, to get in the way of that.
Thank you. My final question.
Interested to see what the Chancellor says. I'm hoping the Chancellor in the budget will actually say something about planning, because we know that she and the Treasury are just as concerned as I am about making sure we can get on with a lot of these developments.
I won't get anyone to take the bet. I'll put a £5 on that she does say something about planning. But let me just, my final question before I hand over to the rest of the panel. Can I just ask you about energy security? And again, obviously with the situation in Ukraine/Russia, we've been very concerned about securing a greater degree of energy security. How are we doing on that?
I think pretty well. I mean, I kept up getting asked this question in the House of Lords. I had a small bill called the Great British Energy Bill, which somehow their lordships turned into day after day of debate, and this came up. I mean, without being complacent, the point is we have diverse sources of energy. We have the North Sea still, so it is a valuable asset. We are developing renewables and nuclear in this country. We have interconnectors with neighbouring countries. So I think myself that I'm not worried about energy security. I think that what we're doing is moving as quickly as we possibly can to having complete energy security. But in the meantime, the diverse sources we have will always provide a comfort to us. That doesn't mean to say, you don't every so often reach a point where the system comes under pressure. But in terms of substantive issue, I don't think we have one.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Right, Thea, have you got a question, please, for Lord Hunt?
I have. Thank you very much, Sasha. And Lord Hunt, hello again.
Hi.
My question, I think like you, I agree that we can reach clean power by, if not 2030, then by 2035. There's clean.
I'm more optimistic than you are.
I think. I don't know if that reflects my experiences of going through the process, promoting lots of solar schemes or not, but in any event, by 2035 for sure. But my question is about the hard to abate sectors: industry, agriculture, aviation. What is those emissions which potentially threaten us getting to net zero?
Well, they're all very tough, aren't they? And I think where I'm particularly confident, is in relation to industry. And, we had the case about carbon capture, usage and storage. The government is committing over £20 billion to develop the technology and concept. I mean, this could be a great story for the UK if we can pull off the technology, store the carbon back into the North Sea, which, as you said, is a huge resource, not just for the UK, but for other countries of Europe as well. And I think the other optimistic point I have about industry is, as you know, data centers are being developed very quickly. UK is an attractive area for investment, and many of these companies wish to do this aligned to renewable or nuclear energy. And I think that overall on industrial issues, I'm confident we can reach the kind of targets that are being set. Airline industry is much more challenging. The government has a very modest target for sustainable air fuel by 2030, and they are trying to incentivize that through the obligation that has been set. But we have a long way to go, and technology has a long way to go, and people want to fly more. And you'll know the decision about Heathrow, another runway, was made on the basis that can take place within overall emission targets that have been set. And that's going to be, I think, a big challenge to pull off. Agriculture, when I did spend a few glorious months as an agricultural minister when the DEFRA had responsibility for climate change, mitigate adaptation, and I held a joint office. And so I dabbled in dealing with the agricultural sector with the National Farmers Union. I mean, I do think the agriculture sector actually is incredibly innovative. and they get it. And there are all sorts of ideas being developed about how we can reduce the carbon emissions of the agriculture sector. But there is a long way to go. And I'm not one of those who thinks weaning people off eating beef is necessarily the right thing to do. But it remains, I would say, problematic about how much progress are we going to make on transport more generally. Electronic vehicles, targets again for cars, and then heavy goods vehicles 2040 to be phased out using petrol. My worry about all of these things is that in energy, you have a government department, DESNZ, totally focused on this. It comes to transport or DEFRA dealing with agriculture or department dealing with industry, there's less focus inevitably because they have a more general responsibility. And I think that for me, we need as part of our going forward, meeting the nationally determined contribution that we have to do in relation to the Paris Agreement, that we have to give renewed focus on these other sectors. But at this stage, we've got the targets, but my goodness me, we've got a long way to go. And the one thing I've not talked about is housing, and how do we make our housing stock? How do we turn it around from the situation we have at the moment? That is very tough because it's very, very expensive. And we don't have the resources in the public sector, in the public finances, to kind of meet all the challenges we do have. Hence, some of the emphasis on new homes and hopefully on sustainable standards that we built in to the new building standards when they're published.
Thank you so much. Right, Charlie, I think you've got a question, please.
You mentioned the Rolls-Royce project for the small and modular nuclear reactors, and I know you've discussed this in the House of Lords. And I was really wondering do you think they are modular nuclear reactors are the long-term solution for what is an identified really big problem at the moment, which is you've got the twin demands on the one hand, data centers, which we need, but are massively power hungry. And on the other hand, combating the climate crisis. And is MNR the way to cut that Gordian knot?
Well, I think it can help a lot. It's very exciting that Rolls-Royce have won the contract for government support. They've won contracts in Eastern Europe as well. So they're really well placed as a UK company to develop whole fleets of small modular reactors. There's no doubt that if you look at the US experience, that some of the big social media companies are preparing to invest in nuclear developments, particularly the small advanced modular reactors. They are looking at the UK because we are the third, after China and US, we're number 3 in terms of data centers. And when I was a minister, a lot of companies came knocking on my door. The issue is whether they can do this without public funding support. And certainly, it's promising. The preliminary discussions that we've had, I know the Treasury are particularly focused on this. But I would also say that officials in my old department are mightily skeptical of developers who say we don't need public funding, because it's very, very difficult to find almost anywhere in the world a nuclear power plant that has not one way or another had government support. And I think that is the conundrum. The government is going to have to produce some kind of statement over the next few months, setting out what their nuclear appetite is. I hope it will answer some of those questions. It will give the green light to the advanced modular reactor development. I should say one other thing that we don't know yet. Hinkley Point C was built on the site of Hinkley Point A and B. Sizewell C, again, is being built on a site where people locally, they've lived with nuclear power for decades. They have families working it. They're generally supportive. What we don't know yet is the extent to which local people, if, for instance, I live in Birmingham, and if we have a data center, maybe on the outskirts, or maybe in Kings Heath, if the developer comes along and says, and we're going to be low carbon because you've got this advanced modular reactor, what is going to be the reaction? And that, I think, is another conundrum that we do face in relation to developing this. But potentially, yes, the answer is we should go for it.
Very interesting. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Paul.
Philip, my question very much follows on from Charlie's. In the US, there are a vast number of data centers, 124 in Washington state. North Virginia is the world's largest area of data centers. And the knock-on effect is that there's a grasp for power with domestic consumers suffering and prices going up. How do we avoid that problem in the UK?
Well, I think we have to bite the bullet, don't we, and welcome investment in data centers in this country. Potentially one of the great growth areas. It would be absolutely, it would be so backward for us not to embrace the fact that the companies wish to develop in the UK. And of course, there are going to be energy demands. I would say partly that the way we're changing the energy structure will enable us to respond to some of those challenges. And of course, one thing that we should mention is the development of the grid, because clearly part of the infrastructure investment we need to see is a massive expansion of the electricity grid to enable us to move electricity around, which will be a benefit to some of these developers. But I do think, too, coming back to Charlie's question, is that nuclear does have a big role to play here, too. We've got to, and the government's got to, and its challenge is to enable developers to have confidence that modular reactors will get support, that there will not be huge obstacles in their way, and that they can be brought onto the system as quickly as possible. So I do accept, yes, this is a challenge, and the issue of price, energy price in this country is a big problem for us all. But I do think we have to be really pragmatic about areas of potential growth and really go for it. If I look at the mistakes we've made in the past, nuclear is a classic example where Sizewell B was going to be the first of about 10 or 12 plants. And then we had the wobbles, and then other sources of electricity were thought to be cheaper. And we threw away a huge competitive advantage that we could have, particularly in developing a UK supply chain. The new energy paradigm gives us an opportunity, both in renewables, but also nuclear, to redevelop an industry, to have a homegrown energy structure. And AI investment, the data center investment, can help us in that regard. So we really have to go for it.
I hope you're right. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Sasha. I know we've only got 2 minutes left, so I'll make my question really quick. Is the risk with all this sustainable energy that we're going to cover the beautiful English countryside in wind farms?
No. First of all, wind farms are things of beauty in themselves. So I think that, the reality is, take solar and wind farms. If you were to agree to every project that was vaguely in the system at the moment, we would still have our beautiful rolling countryside, and we would still have 98% of agricultural land. So I think that, people get emotive about it, but we need to plough on, and we're not going to despoil the whole of the English countryside because of it.
Okay, that'll please Thea no end.
Aura.
Thanks, Sasha. Final Lord, thank you so much for your answers thus far. I was going to come back to nuclear, if that's all right, against the context of someone who's been involved in the AFD at HBC for a very long time. But it is the case that of the 8 sites that are listed in EN6, the National Policy Statement, only 2 of those have been granted development consent, and you mentioned those already. Do you think that there's more that the government can do to encourage large nuclear power stations to come forward?
Well, as you know, EN7 sort of embraces those sites, but also tries to open it up much more. And I think, we've been talking about small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors, but we shouldn't forget the potential of the large gigawatt sites. And obviously, Hinkley Point C, Sizewell C, both 3.2 gigawatt, 6 million homes each will be powered through them. I think government has a big question to answer, which I hope they are going to answer over the next few months, which is what is their appetite for nuclear going forward? So the last government had a roadmap where they mentioned 24 gigawatts, but it was never funded or planned for. My government, the current government, needs, I think, to give greater certainty to the industry going forward. And they need to answer a question about whether they see more Hinkley Point Cs and Sizewell Cs, as well as the small modular reactors. My view is we need both. The challenge is that Sizewell C is essentially owned by the government. It has a regulated asset-based funding model. Private sector money is coming in. But, the Treasury has to bankroll much of its development. And I think one of the big questions is actually, has it got the financial wherewithal in order to be able to put the money in that will be necessary for building more of the gigawatt plants? I hope the answer is yes, but I do think they need to reassure the industry as a whole and give them a really good direction about where we're going to in the future. Overall, the nuclear industry in this country is now in a great shape. It's high quality jobs, fantastic contribution to the economy, and we really need to build on it. And also, I think public opposition has changed. I mean, I really do think that being seen as a low carbon energy, I do think public attitudes towards nuclear has become much more positive in the last few years, and we want to build on that as well.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lord Hunt. That was absolutely fascinating, genuinely. So thank you. Charlie, back to you.
Thanks, Sash, and thank you for me for what a wealth of experience you bring to all these issues and huge insight. So really hugely enjoyed that interview. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. It's been great. Great experience.
Fantastic. Well, fantastic. I'm looking forward to working with you on various things. Maybe even a second planning bill. Who knows? What might
I don't know about Charlie. I should say my next effort is on assisted dying, which I'm frankly not too keen on. I see you put an amendment down on it as well.
Same side on that, actually, as well.
Okay, so it's good news.
Yeah. So, once again. Great stuff. Well, look, thank you again. And thank you to our viewers. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. But until then, have a good fortnight. Thank you very much indeed.